Welcome to the St. Augustine Chronicles, the where, the who, and the how'd they get there. This morning, I am so pleased to have as my guest Dr. Susan Parker, who, as those of you who know St. Augustine know, is an expert in St. Augustine's history, in the Spanish periods of our history. She is the go-to in the community for anything historic St. Augustine. However, today, I want to get to know Susan's history. I want to learn about what it was like growing up here in St. Augustine and just let her tell her story being a native St. Augustinian.
I think that'll work.
So Susan, you grew up in St. Augustine, right? Did you live here your whole life?
Pretty much. I was gone for a little while in my early 20s. Both my parents came here as toddlers. And so they were living here, and so I was born here. And my parents were living in a small little house on Valana Beach when I was born.
So I thought, I had talked to some people who grew up in St. Augustine, and they said that Valana was really about just these little beach shacks where people would go on the weekends, and nobody really lived there. But your parents did live
Well,
in
it
Valana.
belonged to my grandparents, and so I think, right after the war, it was a place to live. It was a one-bedroom house. And, I barely remember it because we moved to Davis Shores when I was about 4. And that's really where I grew up, was on Davis Shores.
Were you one of the original residents of Davis Shores? There weren't that many homes back then, were there?
Well, of course, right after World War II, they built a lot of homes, and then they opened R.B. Hunt School. So the house that I lived in, of course, there had never been another house on that lot
Right.
before that. And my mother lived there all the rest of her life until she died. She lived there 55 years. And it was on the street about 3 houses south of the Conch House. Excuse me, 3 houses south of the Conch House. And at the time, one of the memories that I have is, of course, Conch Island had not really filled in and built up like it is now. It was just, when the inlet was cut through in 1940 to make it a shorter run for the boats, the southern part of Valana Beach was cut off, and so that's what Conch Island actually built up from. A lot of people know that. But when I was a child, you could look right out at the ocean from where I was.
You could?
There were some sandbars out there, but in windy and rough weather, you could see the whitecaps, and we went swimming right in front of, right across the street, right there where now you couldn't go swimming because, well, there's docks, but other than that, there's marsh grass, there's oysters, but it was very beach-like at the time. So we grew up there. And one of the funny stories when you asked me about this, I remembered is, and this is just a typical kid thing, but it also is about the whole environment. And when we grew up, I had the, well, I'll call it the oceanfront or the waterfront bedroom anyway. And one night, I must have been about 8 or 9. I woke up because I could see these lights blinking out on the ocean. Well, of course, I learned later on, after I told my father what I had seen and what had scared me. He said, "Oh, that's men digging for flounder." I thought it was a Russian submarine coming ashore. Because, of course, at the time,
The German subs had come, or
no, not the Germans. This was the Russians.
yeah,
and we
but
were
the
all
Germans
worried
had
about
come
the
prior to
Russians
that.
taking,
So
yeah. Well, who else
why
would
not
be
the
out there
Russians?
with white lights but Russians trying to come ashore and take over St. Augustine? If you're going to take over the U.S., aren't you going to start in St. Augustine?
And let me stop you right there, just in the middle of that. I'm going to get this mic a little more in between you there so we can just hear you a little bit better.
Okay.
And just get as close to that.
Okay. All right.
All right. Go for it.
Okay.
So it's a little personal story, but it's also because I also brought that up because you did feel like you were just right there, almost on the edge of the ocean.
Did people treat it as a beach?
There weren't too many people that treated it as a beach. There was a lot of boat launching. This was at the end of Flagler Boulevard, and a lot of boat launching. And actually, we lived on property right at the edge of where Davis had dredged in land. And so behind our house, on the west side of the house, not on the water side of the house, we actually had tiny little sand dunes with sea oats growing in them because, of course, that had been the bottom land, the oceanfront land had been dredged up, and so we had sand dunes behind our house.
So you must have been the first resident. Your family was the first resident of that home, correct?
The first, well, I think
was
maybe
new
somebody
built.
else had lived there about 6 months or something like that.
So prior to that, wasn't that area of Davis Shores marsh, swampland?
Well, of course,
It had to be
it had been
filled.
filled in the 20s, but then the as you know the building boom fell apart in Florida, and then the Depression, and then the war, and really Davis Shores sat unbuilt for about 20 years, and then it was and as did much of Florida and all those wartime subdivisions, and so right after the war, that was a place to build new houses because there were all these new baby boom families that were coming along.
So did anyone have, now Davis Shores, has such flooding issues. Did anyone think this used to be marsh and maybe we shouldn't live here back then? Or did they think it's been filled, there's no issues? Was there any concern at all about that?
I don't know. I was a kid. I didn't. I will tell you though, when I was very young, I do remember what now we would call it must have been storm surge. I mean, we had water in our front yard. It just came
So it was
right up.
happening back then.
Right, but now you have, of course, the barrier island has built up out there. At that time, it really just kind of washed over. They were sandbanks. You could see the seagulls sit out there at low tide, and at high tide, they didn't sit out there because the water was too deep for seagulls. Um, I don't know. A lot of it was low. They probably filled it in sporadically. I'm not sure. And, who knows how much that was almost 100 years ago, how
Yeah.
much the land has
Gosh, how's that
compressed,
possible?
how much the land has compressed over time, because it will compress. I don't know what the compression might be.
Was that the cool place to live because it was new?
Well, we thought so. Because we went to a brand new school, R.B. Hunt. I was in third grade when I became an R.B. Hunt person, and there were only 6 classrooms. So there was no escaping the people you didn't like. It was 6th grade, 6 classrooms, and I didn't dislike that many people, but it was kind of fun. It was the same people all the time, and of course the alligator farm was right across the
Well, I was
street,
going to ask you, yeah.
as it still is, and the school didn't have air conditioning when we started out, of course. And so right in the middle of the lessons, especially in the spring and in the fall, you'd hear the screech of the ostrich or the peacock or something like that.
Was there any concern about living so close to the alligator farm? Did people worry about the alligators getting out? You hear these urban legends during hurricanes now. Oh, the alligators got out, and that's not true. But
My friends and I have laughed about this, and of course, very few people our parents' age are alive anymore. They worried about things, but they didn't worry about the things that parents worry about now.
oh, I know. I agree. Absolutely.
They did not. They did not. I
Yeah.
mean, we've all heard the stories. During the summer, you left on your bicycle at 9 or 10
Yeah.
in the morning,
Yeah.
and you showed back up, maybe for lunch. If
Yeah.
not, you ate with a friend, and you showed back up at 5, for dinner. And I don't think they wanted to know that we didn't go where we told them we were going. They just said, "Have a good time."
I grew up in a real small farm town in Wisconsin, and it was the same. That we didn't check in. We just did our thing, and parents didn't really care.
Well,
They
and
figured if something bad happened, they'd find out.
well, and the north side of A1A, the side because I lived on Camaris, um, built up sooner than the south side did. I think the lots over there were lower was probably one of the reasons they were more, they took some fill. And and hardly any of the roads were paved on Davis Shores at that time.
They weren't paved.
Well, Oglethorpe was, and A1A was, and that was about it. Flagler, but that was about it. And they paved them later. They paved them and put in sanitary sewer because we had a septic tank when I was growing up. But what I was going to bring it up, you talking about parents not paying attention or something. If you were riding your bicycle around, which I did all the time, on the south side of A1A, Coquina, Matanzas, those areas, people were always killing rattlesnakes over there. I don't think our parents thought
What possible harm could come?
And I'm not saying my parents didn't care. It just wasn't the sort of thing that crossed their mind. They were more concerned, especially when we were young, in the summer, was making sure that you didn't get polio, before the polio vaccine came out.
When did the polio vaccine come out? I know I have.
I am really dating myself here, but anyway,
I
I
don't
must
know
have been in
exactly.
4th or 5th grade, but I do remember when I was younger, they had what they called, and it's very, of course, current right now to think about the polio
Right,
virus
right.
and how important the vaccine was. It was called polio season, or the idea at the time was, that the spring May and June, late spring was the time that polio was around. I don't know that much about it, but I do remember that we couldn't go swimming before a certain date because we might expose ourselves to polio. Now, I'm not saying there's a medical basis for this,
Yeah,
but
but
that
that's
was
what they believe.
yeah, that's what they were. So they were very, very concerned about, and I think there's been a lot of medical changes, obviously, that parents now can be much more. Not they don't care; they don't have to worry about it. You know, only a few years before I was born, penicillin came into being. So parents no longer had to worry about those type of infections, but they still did because they had grown up with it. So scratches and things like that were treated quite seriously.
Well, I remember that when I was growing up, and I was born in 1964, but again, in a small town in Wisconsin, and I was a swimmer from an early age. We had a community pool, and so in the summers, I swam and was on the swim teams, and I used to get ear infections constantly, like 3 or 4 every summer, and I remember going to the small town doctor, and he would tell my mom to just put peroxide in my ears, and then she had to take a cotton ball, coat it with Vaseline, put that in my ear, and that was supposed to try to keep the water out because I couldn't stay out of the pool because I was on
Cotton
something.
doesn't absorb water.
Right, yeah. So that was, but there was no antibiotic. It was peroxide that he told her to use.
But when I was talking about parents not being so concerned about certain things, there's also much different than now. And I'm not saying one's better than the other. On the other hand, every parent felt they were responsible in some way for every kid.
Oh yeah.
And there
Absolutely.
was no problem with chastising someone else's child because they were misbehaving.
Yeah, and you lived by their rules when you were in their house as well. And if they were different from yours, you had to follow their rules.
And St. Augustine was a small town, so a lot of people knew each other. My mother's mother had a jewelry store on St. George Street where the Columbia is now, in the city building, which of course was where Flagler's Model Land Company was. At that time, it was demolished. And then after a number of years, they built the Columbia. So that was kind of my base of operations downtown, was there on the corner of St. George and Hippolyta Street. And I bring this up because one of the things, I went to the library a lot. And when you were 14, you could go to the adult library. You could still go to the children's library, but you could also check out books at the adult library. Now, of course, the library is where the St. Augustine Historical Society Library is now.
Okay.
On Avallie Street.
Yep.
That was the public library. And there are still times when I go up those stairs, because I go up those stairs a lot to do research, that I'm taken back many, many years to the, stereotypical librarian at the top of the stairs who was scrutinizing me all the time. Well, I went in one day, and part of the story is here that my grandmother went to the library a lot. She checked out books all the time. So I went in there when I was in 9th grade, and Peyton Place was a very scandalous book at the time.
Yep.
Very popular. And so I went in and I was looking around on the shelves, and she says, "Susan, may I help you?" And I said, "Yes, I'm looking for Peyton Place." "We do not have any books like Peyton Place in this library. You'll just have to find something else." Okay. Yeah, I found something else. All right, fine. Well, that's great. Except by the time I walked from Avallie Street down to 96 St. George Street to my grandmother's jewelry store, she had already been told by the librarian and been told that I had been trying to check out Peyton Place.
I thought maybe you were going to tell me that you got home and your grandmother said, "I have the copy." Right
No, but my mother did in her closet, which I found out later. But I think, I bring it up because it's numerous things, but it's also about everybody, in a sense, feeling like they were responsible to report this possible misdeed. And there was good and bad sides to it.
Right.
There was certainly, in a sense, much more protection.
How many
children.
people lived here? Do you know what the population was about that time?
No, I don't. And the thing is, St. Augustine itself, as you well know, the city hasn't grown because it's just so limited in size, and it doesn't. We haven't put any high-rise buildings, so the population of St. Augustine is pretty constant over a very long period of time. Obviously, the county has grown.
Yeah, it's just all the outside of the city limits where they have a St. Augustine address. That makes it grow.
Right.
Yeah.
But and of course, at the time, we rode our bicycles everywhere. I was in 4th grade, and I'd ride it across the Bridge of Lions and park it downtown. It was just there wasn't much thought that there was any issue with that. There was very little concern that a child might be accosted by any sort of a predator.
Yeah, no one thought about that when I was growing up either.
And they
wasn't
probably
on
were
any.
around. It's just we weren't made aware of it. So how could we say anything about a predator?
Well, I have to say, I don't think my parents thought about that either. It just wasn't. It wasn't a thing anybody worried about. Were there areas of town that you were told not to go to, or was it pretty much wherever you wanted to go?
Well, I don't know that it was ever actually said. It was certainly very strongly implied that at that time, of course, you did not go down to the black section of town. You did not
Was
go to
that Lincolnville at that time?
Mhm, mhm. So, so that was just, and I wouldn't have had any reason to go to Lincolnville anyway, except to just ride around.
Did the children in Lincolnville, they had their own school, right?
Right.
So you wouldn't have known
No,
any of the children.
I went. I was out of high school before the local schools were integrated, so I always went to an all-white school. I did not know any black children at all.
Were the people in Lincolnville shopping like at your grandmother's store or any place else on St. George
They
Street?
did. Obviously they patronized the more daily type stores in Lincolnville, and I don't want to because I don't. I'm answering a question that I really didn't have any experience. So they shopped everywhere. It was there was obviously still the color line was there when people were shopping. But I just I knew one or two people that worked for my parents or grandparents and things like that, and it's just the way it was.
Yeah.
And I can't apologize for something that's the way it was when I grew up. I'm just hope and I'm glad that that I'm not still stuck
Right.
in that mindset,
Right.
and that I have learned a lot of things about a lot of other people, and in retrospect realized a lot of things that there was no way I saw them at when I was a kid.
Well, as a child, it's difficult to think differently from your parents as well. It doesn't occur to you that you can have a different mindset in grade school or maybe middle school it starts, but you do what your parents have told you, what you believe what your parents have taught you. You just don't know any differently, and you were growing up in the South, and that's just the way it was.
Oh yeah, there wasn't any place close by that was any different.
Right. Right.
So
So the schools were integrated when you were in high school, you said?
no, after I graduated, probably 2 or 3 years after I graduated.
Was that difficult here? Do you know? Were you here then or
No, I was at college by then. I know there were some issues. I don't know that it was as I don't know that there was as much violence here as there was other places. I wasn't here, and I really paid hardly any attention to it. I was off at college, and I had left St. Augustine behind.
Never coming back.
In my mind.
That worked out well, right?
Right. I had big plans.
I find it hard to believe that most people growing up here in the oldest city, well, there's qualifiers, I know, but in our historic city, I find it hard to believe that most people didn't have a great interest in history. Do you feel you always did, didn't you?
Well, I mean, I think I've told a lot of people I picked it up by osmosis almost. I mean, now that doesn't mean you always heard it was correct, but we still had the tourists here. We had the tour trains. We had, historic places for people to go. A lot more horse and carriages than there are now. And you went by the fort all the time. You saw the fort all the time. For me, how could it not become part of your part of yourself? And it's interesting because when I left here and went to college, I was a Spanish major, and proportionately there were a lot of people out of my class that became Spanish majors. Now we had a very good Spanish teacher. So maybe it was a combination of both her and the exposure to Spanish things.
You probably felt somewhat Spanish.
And of course, as I went on, much later with all the historical studies, then you realized how much of what you picked up was really part of the spiel.
Well,
And I still make people mad when I tell them, well, that's not true.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you probably can't follow the tour trains because you can correct everything they're saying.
I've kind of given up on most of all of that.
You know, my office is on Hippolyta, and they go by, they do their loop on Hippolyta every day, you know, I don't know how many times a day. And they definitely have okay, we're here now, we're going to say this statement.
Oh, yeah.
Because I hear the same thing coming out of their mouth every time they go by my office. And I can tell you, I could rattle it off. We all laugh, and I don't know if it's true or not.
Well, you know, several years ago, two friends of mine, we all graduated from here. And one of them lived in California, one of them lived in Boston, and we went to my friends in California, and we spent a day trip. We went to Catalina Island, and we took the tour train.
You were a tourist.
We were tourists. We took the tour train, and at one point they both looked over and they said, "Doesn't this sound like the tour in St. Augustine with just different names injected?" And I said, "Yes, it does." So yeah, there's kind of a tour train
spiel,
yeah, or culture or way of doing things. And neither of them had lived here in quite a long time, but they remembered the tour trains. This is like being in St. Augustine. We're on the Pacific, and it's a different place. But
it's interchangeable.
Absolutely.
So how many brothers and sisters do you have?
I had one younger brother, and my like I said, my mother's mother had a jewelry store on St. George Street, and my father's parents had an appliance store and a garage on San Marco.
Yeah,
it's still out there.
It's still there.
Yes,
yeah.
It's not involved with the family anymore, but they still continue to use the name. And so I got to play around at the jewelry store, and then I got to play around at the car repair and appliance repair place.
Were most of your grandmother's jewelry store customers locals, or were they visitors?
Oh, I think most of them were local. You know, first off, she didn't really have anything that would necessarily appeal to tourists. And the other thing is that, you know, when I was a kid, certainly we had tourists, but it was not as big a piece of the economy in St. Augustine as it is now.
What was the economy then?
Well, of course, the railroad, the Florida East Coast Railroad, was a huge piece of the economy. People worked for the railroad, in the railroad offices and on the trains.
I didn't realize that.
Yes,
that was such a driver.
It was because the offices for the railroad were, of course, where Flagler has redone the dorms. You know, they had passenger service, they had, you know, personal freight service and things like that. So, yeah, a number of people worked, you know, both in the offices and on the trains. The shrimping industry, I have trouble thinking of shrimping as an industry, but anyway, the shrimping industry was big as well.
Yeah, I'm actually going to bring John Versaghi in September, and he's going to talk about the history of the shrimping industry.
So, you know, so there were other parts of the economy that brought in money, and so my grandmother would not have really had any reason. She would sell to a tourist, but she would have no reason to really encourage tourist sales sales to tourists.
Was it more seasonal as well?
It was. Tourism? It was actually, you know, the Ponce de Leon Hotel would open up which I remember some, in the winter, but really it was more of a summer tourist season when kids were out of school.
Was the beach still as popular then to go visit as tourists, or was it more downtown?
I would say it was more downtown, and of course you didn't have the numbers. You didn't have nearly the places to stay on the beach. I mean, you had to drive to the beach and drive onto the beach, you know.
Well, that was another question I was going to ask you. It was really kind of separate, right? It was St. Augustine, and then it was the beach.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't. Now it's sort of interchangeable. And,
right,
5
right.
minutes
Because
away.
the minute you kind of left the alligator farm on the road, there was hardly anything in between there and where Pope Road is now. You were just sort of driving along in, you know, growth.
Unpaved road?
No.
Oh, it was paved?
It was paved. You know, Anastasia Park was a good bit different. There was no camping at Anastasia Park. It was just a lot different. Of course, there were all these ramps to the beach where you could drive down, and the beaches were open, you know, round the clock. There were no restrictions on any time of day of driving on the beaches.
Were there restaurants along the beach in St. Augustine, what is now St. Augustine Beach, or was
Not
it?
many? There was a little hot dog stand on the pier, and then of course there was what has become the beach corner at A Street, and there were a few other little places to get a few sandwiches, but certainly not like the restaurants are now. Certainly not that I remember.
And then Volano, as I said, I talked to someone else who grew up here at one point, and she said Volano was where they kind of went on the weekends, and everybody had these unair conditioned, one room, kind of shacks, and
right.
that was what everybody had.
I
there.
remember my parents renting some places there, and we'd stay for a week or two because we were right on the beach. You're right, that's true. I remember the screen houses.
Yeah, that's what she said. It was just really, it was almost like camping.
And of course, which probably somebody else has mentioned, Porpoise Point was not where people lived. It was where there were dunes that you drove your car around.
Oh, no, nobody's told me that.
Yeah, Porpoise Point hadn't been developed as a residential area like many places. I think part of it had been platted in the 20s, and then nothing was built for decades. So we'd go riding around back there, and sometimes you get stuck in the soft dune sand, and sometimes you wouldn't. I had a very small car, so if I had a friend or two with me, we were quite capable of pushing it out. Even the girls were quite capable of pushing it out of the soft sand.
Well, that's one thing I wanted to ask you about. It must have been really different for girls and boys.
Oh.
Particularly, and again, you're in the South, which I think must have magnified that as well.
Yes, it certainly was. Of course, because one of the memories of course, my children are just stunned by some of this. But girls had to wear skirts to school. They could not wear shorts.
Yep.
They could not wear jeans or anything
Yep.
like that. So you had, and because I lived, in Camaris, most of us an awful lot of us rode our bicycles to RV Hunt, and you had to pedal along in the skirts, which was fine. But you couldn't catch up with the boys because to pedal fast enough, of course, you
Your
have to
skirt would blow
stand
up.
up, and my skirt would blow up. And somehow, although they never said it exactly, I knew that my entire family dynasty would collapse if anyone ever saw my underpants. So only in the summer when I could wear shorts on my bicycle could I attempt to keep up with the boys. You think I'm kidding? I mean, I knew that there was just, something cataclysmic that was going to happen if my dress blew up high enough.
No, when I was in the first few grades in elementary school, we had to wear dresses. Yeah. And again, grew up in Wisconsin, so in the winter when we had to go outside and play, and didn't matter winter, summer, we went out for our recess. And so we had to put our snow pants on underneath of our dresses, and then the dress would hang down over the snow pants when we went outside.
Well, and there was still a lot of unbuilt lots, vacant lots on Davis Shores at the time. And of course they became, baseball or softball places for playing that.
For the boys, or did the girls?
No, the girls could play too sometimes. But you were still a girl, right? If you had 2 strikes, there was a guy right there behind you saying, "I'm taking your last bat because you're not striking out." Because no girl could possibly, Now, I'm not saying they didn't need better, but it was called last bat. You'd go up to the batter's box and they say, last bat. And, you get to pick who got your last bat in case you struck out twice. But, on the other hand, because I can't help being a historian no matter what, I think it was, there was a good aspect to that because kids, there were no coaches or anything.
Right.
So they had to make up the rules that worked.
Right.
And they found out they had their own hands-on experience as to how to, regulate other people so that you didn't ruin the game.
Yeah.
And all that sort of thing. I mean, there's 2 sides to everything.
Yeah.
And I think there's a benefit to that. Where so what are we going to do about this rule? We've never thought about what happens if the ball gets hit, into somebody's yard that has a fence.
Yeah.
Now what do we do?
Yeah.
So I think there was a benefit to that, to being sometimes on our own so much, because we did have to figure out how to do things and we got to screw up much more.
Were there jobs in St. Augustine that were only for females? Like when you were growing up, when you were a teenager and you wanted to get a part-time job, there must have been jobs where only girls would do this and only boys would do this.
Yeah, it was probably more that there were jobs that only boys could do. You know, I mean, there were some that they probably didn't want to do.
Well, I mean, did you still had the soda fountain, right?
There were soda fountains. Yeah. I don't remember. I never had very many jobs as a teenager. I think there's just a lot of things my parents didn't want me to do, and so that was probably it. And you know, it's just my family didn't need the money that I might bring in
Yeah.
during the summer,
Yeah.
which gave me that, you know, that
freedom.
leisure, that
Yeah.
freedom not to have
Yeah.
to be able to go down to the beach and drive on the beach all the time.
So what was it like going to, you went to St. Augustine High School, right?
Right,
Everybody
uh-huh.
went to St. Augustine High School. What was it like going to St. Augustine High School then?
You know,
How big was it?
we had 140 people in my senior class.
Oh, that's actually pretty big.
I mean, so obviously we had a lot more people when I started in my freshman class. It was a lot more typical for people to drop out of school by the time they were 16, especially the boys. I think probably that was very often that the family needed money,
Mm-hmm.
and also sometimes the boys just weren't doing well in school.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, like I said, it was a segregated school. You know, I taught middle school briefly in my mid-20s, and so that's really the only comparison I have to how high school or anything else would have been.
Segregated in that there were sections of St. Augustine High School that were for the black children?
No,
and
there were no blacks at St. Augustine High School when I was there. They went to Murray, which of course is now a middle school. That was
Oh, I
that
didn't
was
know
the high
that.
school, right? Uh-huh. And some of the guys, and I'm talking here about something that I didn't, what I heard. This is what I've heard. I hate to talk about things that I really didn't experience, and somebody says, "No, you're wrong." But a number of the guys in that I went to school with were friendly, especially with the basketball players at Murray. So the white basketball players at St. Augustine High School and the black basketball players at Murray. And the guys from St. Augustine High School would go to watch the Murray High School games. But the guys from Murray did not come to watch the games at the white high school.
That's it seems so I didn't grow up in the South, and it just seems so strange to me, but it's not that long ago.
It's not that long ago. Well, and I think probably everybody, like I used the word osmosis of picking up the historicness of St. Augustine. A lot of this was just picked up, and I'm sure by the black children as well. I can't speak for
Yeah.
them. Just by looks or being grabbed.
Sure.
You don't do that.
Yeah.
You know, no one ever said you cannot do. They didn't name what it was you couldn't do.
You just didn't think to
You
do it.
figured it out
Yeah.
pretty quickly by
Yeah.
the disapproval and other things like that. And parents were, you know, they I guess parents still do, but they certainly controlled a lot with disapproval and worried about what other people thought.
Yeah. So you
just like not being able to ride my bicycle and have my dress blow up. Yeah.
Well, look where that got them.
Yeah.
So you went to college, and then did you come back right away?
No, I stayed away for a little while, and then I ended up back here.
And I'm so glad you did come back, because I can't imagine St. Augustine without you, Susan. I really can't. You are the go-to for everything historic here.
Well, I didn't start out to do that, but you know how life just kind of goes in those directions. It's interesting to, of course, as you know, I mean, I really specialize in the colonial period,
Yeah.
which has given me a whole different perspective, obviously, on St. Augustine from years ago, because we hear about the fort and we hear about Menendez Landing, but we don't ever hear much about the residents that live here, and it's giving me a much different perspective. But it's also given me a much different perspective on the St. Augustine I grew up in. You know, looking at it from a historian's perspective and putting it all in. You know, so I have kind of ambivalent feelings. I don't apologize for the way I was as a child, because that's just the way
You didn't know any different.
I was raised.
Right.
You know, like I said, I know people now who I don't think are any more evolved than they were then, and I'm hoping that I've become more evolved in the time in between. You know, I hate to think of any of us just, you know, taking up space on the earth and not changing and learning. But St. Augustine is a really interesting place. And in 2 weeks, I'm giving the what's called the Augustinian address. That is they have a speaker every year on the feast day of St. Augustine. And this year, because the diocese is having its 150th anniversary, they're doing something a little different. So they've asked me to speak about what St. Augustine was like at the time the diocese was created.
When was that?
1870. And it's been very interesting to do the research for that, because as always when I do research, I go in and I say, I'll just sit down and write this, but I'll do a little research, and then it's like
2 weeks later.
2 weeks. Well, not only that, it's like, it's always humbling because I find out how wrong I was about things. But it's a time we don't pay much attention to. Flagler hadn't arrived. You didn't have all that glamour yet. But I'm going to be speaking about the changes, or what St. Augustine went through in about the 5 years at the end of the Civil War and up to that time. And
Boy, that's timely.
Well, it is. I don't want to give my whole talk away right here. It is amazing because of what we have been going through over the past, is it only 5 months, I think, with the coronavirus issues and the economic and the social issues and just so many things because of it. There are so many similarities of what people in St. Augustine are trying to return to the new normal. And of course, there is no new normal. I think that's one thing I've learned as a historian. It may be new, but you need to get rid of the word normal.
No. And we're still here.
Oh, yeah.
They figured it out. We'll figure it out.
Yeah,
we're still here.
Humans manage to, but I have been stunned by some of the things that are. It's like, oh my gosh, this sounds like I could talk about this right now and just put in a slightly different thing. Reopening of schools was an issue in 1866 or 1867. And who's going to go to them, and where are they going to go, and where are the newly freed black children going to go to school, if they're even going to go to school? That was just one. I thought the reopening of schools. I mean, they're actually calling it reopening of school in the newspapers. So it's really interesting to see how, and I think it's because something. Obviously, the war was more drastic than COVID, but that total change in life and the total stopping of so much that we're familiar with, people have to come back from that and figure out how to do it.
But they did. I mean, that's the takeaway, really, is
they did.
We're still here.
Some with success and some not with success.
Yeah, but we kept going. So you came back to St. Augustine, but didn't really get. You still hadn't hit your stride as a historian.
No,
yet. How did that come?
I actually did title research for quite a while.
Oh, that's a waste of you.
But
I mean, it can be a little bit interesting, but
well, yes, because when I was doing it, I was also there with all the old books that you could pull out at the courthouse. So I'm not saying I was always looking for what I should have. I could go back and look at the books from the 1820s and 1830s as well as more recently. The woman who was the historian at the state agency, the St. Augustine Preservation Board, Amy Bushnell, found out that I knew Spanish, and she asked me if I would do some volunteering for her. And I had started to go back to graduate school 2 or 3 times, and I never figured out why every time I started to go to graduate school, I would end up pregnant. So I was afraid to try to go to graduate school anymore. There didn't seem to be any relationship, but there was some. So finally, successfully, I managed to go to graduate school without having any more children. And went back and got my master's and PhD in history.
And then you were here then, right?
Yes, I was really fortunate because the historian's job at the Preservation Board became open, and they needed somebody right away because of a grant that was in process. So I was hired for the position usually before they usually would have hired somebody not before they had their master's, and I didn't have my master's yet. So I was pretty busy because I was working, well, basically 8 to 5 and sometimes on the weekends, and then going to classes in Gainesville.
And you had children.
And I had children, yeah. So
how did you do all that?
I don't know, and don't ask me if I'd do it again because I don't know that I would. I mean, really, I don't.
Especially when people weren't really doing that then. Women weren't.
No,
really doing that.
And there's always the pragmatic side. 207 had not been 4-laned, much out of town, you know. So most of the road to Gainesville was 2 lane. And my classes generally got over in Gainesville at 10 o'clock at night.
Oh my gosh.
And I had to drive back in the dark, which every now and then got pretty much pre-cell phone. People had cell phones, but not like they have them now, you know. So, yeah, you know, and I look back, it's like, I'm not sure why I did this.
Well, like I said, it seems, you know,
I told you that getting a PhD has nothing to do with your
Making you
intelligence.
smart.
It has to do with your tenacity.
But I can't imagine growing up here, and I didn't grow up here. I can't imagine growing up here and not relishing the history because it's just around you. And I like history, so maybe I'm coming at it from that point of view. But I can't. I'm almost surprised that more people who grew up here didn't become didn't find St. Augustine's history as some sort of career path for them, because it's just you're living it, you're here. So,
Well, and I think some of that is it's what people think history is. You know, they think it's presidents and kings and dates, and of course that's a very old-fashioned way. It is, but still it's an old-fashioned way to treat history. And I think we've talked about it, that you know that there's, in the midst of it all, there's people who are trying to figure out how to handle what the surprises that have been tossed at them, and
Yeah.
how they
Yeah.
adapt to it, and
Yeah.
just to be local about it. Whether it's a hurricane, I mean, certainly Hurricane Matthew was not the first hurricane that inundated this city.
but it always seems like it when you're in it.
Right,
You know?
that's true. That's true. That's true. You know, so they had many times to adapt to that, to fires, to other things, to, you know, reopening of schools. You know, I just mentioned it. You know, I think people don't see history as seeing how other people 100 years ago or 50 years ago or whatever it is live their lives doing a lot of the same things that we do, and that the same things were important to them. You know, their children, their families. I think that gets lost sometimes. And families are different, but they're also the same.
So you write a column for the St. Augustine Record, the newspaper, and you write it is it Sunday it comes out?
Every Sunday.
Yeah. I read it all the time. I love it. What I love about your column is kind of what you just talked about. It's a historical column, and you always have some topic in St. Augustine's history, but I feel like I'm just sitting down having a cup of coffee with you. You don't write it from a dry history book perspective. You throw in your little comments about the here and now, and it feels like we're just talking. It's not this I'm reading a history book type of thing.
Well,
I
you know,
learned so much.
That's I mean, that's a Sunday morning column. I figure a lot of people read it over their coffee. They didn't intend to sit down to read a 700-page book. You know, the column is hardly ever 700 words even. You know, so it has to be entertaining, and yet I hope that people get more than just some silly little story out of it, you know, to realize that this happened before and it's sort of happening again. And I started out writing the column. It was very short. It was limited to 250 words. It was very short, which was
That's nothing.
that's very challenging to try to make an intro that gets somebody's attention, give them a little bit of meat, and
An end.
an end in 250 words. It's basically a soundbite, you know. So when I got more space, it became easier to write the column. And I didn't set out to try to, and I don't every time, but for the most part, to tie it to something that's going on, whether it's local.
But it seems like you do.
Well, I mean, I do now intentionally, because I realized from feedback that that's what people liked. And when they first said it, and it's always surprising to me, as you've got this audience out there, and you hear one or two people usually say something like, I like your column, or I'll get an email every now and then. But I'm always surprised as to what they focus on and they take from it. Because people, you know, because people are different comments or different facts resonate differently with different people. And sometimes someone will say, oh, you know, and then there's always ones that say, I know what your hidden message was. Well,
I thought thought a couple
Well,
times.
good, because there wasn't one.
Yeah, I've thought a couple times. I think there might be one, but
Every now and then there
yeah,
is.
but
Every now and then there is. And I will say, I am a very, I'm not saying I'm very political, but I pay a lot of attention to politics. So many times I write my column and then I go back through and I scrub it.
but part of that also is, if
Because
you're
there's
writing
only
about,
so far I can go in the column without losing my audience and losing the column.
but if you're writing about history and a historical perspective, then politics plays into that as well. So
hugely, hugely. I just, it's hard. I have to stay away from current politics because you'll alienate a lot of your audience right away.
Can't win.
And I don't think that's what the newspaper wants. Anyway, so as I said, I write it and very often go back and say, that sentence probably needs to be made a little milder.
Well, again, I don't want to gloss over the career that you've had, but it's not my focus today. I don't want you to go down the historian is going to come in and talk about, those sorts of things. But I'm curious, what are some of the changes that you've seen in St. Augustine that, looking back, surprise you? What are some things that now we have here, or we've done here, or we see here, that you never could have imagined growing up?
I think the number of people that come here surprises me. Certainly the number of, and not just, right now it's kind of an exception, but in general, the number of people that are here all the time, the number of people that are down at the beach, because I live very near St. Augustine Beach, the number of people, when I go down to the beach, just the numbers.
It's crowded.
Yeah, the numbers of people that are there surprise me. I think the other thing that surprises me is sometimes, and I'm not saying this is just St. Augustine, it's where we live, sometimes how long it takes any issue to reach resolution or decision even. Resolution may be wrong because you still have people that are unhappy. It took us, whichever side you're on, it took the community and the state years to do anything about the Bridge of Lions.
Yep.
They were complaining about it in the late 1970s and 1980s. And there was repairs and stuff, but the bridge solution, I guess you might say, really didn't happen until 2005. It took over 25 years.
And many people say we didn't do it right.
Well, I understand.
Right?
that. Maybe solution
we
is,
still have those.
Yeah. Maybe I should say
should have done this.
Conclusion. Yeah. But it went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So in between, I remember there was one person here, I won't mention him, and he said, because of course they got the bridge placed on the National Register of Historic Places.
Yeah.
There was one of the older people in town, probably born in the 20s, I would say. And of course, the bridge was built in 1927 or completed in 1927. And he would say, "Well, if that bridge is historic, so am I." And I told somebody, and I said, "But no, the bridge is historically significant. That's the difference."
Is he still around?
I'm not going to answer that. I'm not going to answer that.
Perhaps he's becoming more historically significant.
and I see his perspective, because if there's something that was created the same time you were, and we're talking about 1980, 1981, it's only 55 or 60 years old. It doesn't seem very old,
right?
Especially if you don't.
The older you get, the less those things seem old too.
Nobody wants to, nobody wants to be called old,
right?
Even if
right.
you are,
right?
I got off the airplane in New Orleans and went out to meet my family, and my granddaughter was probably 3 or 4 at the time. I walked out to where they were greeting me, and I said hi, and she said, "Hey, Grandma, are you old?" And I said, "Yeah, I get." I thought, but your grandparents have to be old, just by definition, they are. But it was like, I'm still not sure I'm historic. But
my mom always comments about all the old people that are bad drivers here in St. Augustine. She's in her late 70s, 80, and
it's not restricted to the old people.
She's always saying these old people in St. Augustine, they can't drive. I don't know what old is.
Well,
to her,
it's because my mother's mother, who had the jewelry store, she was a very big influence on my life. She became a widow when I was like a year old, and so I think, took a lot of the attention my grandfather would have gotten and put it on me. And she ran a business. She started working at 13 because she was the oldest of children, in a household whose father had died, and she had worked her whole life. And she was very independent and loved to spend money and things like that. But I remember her saying to me, we were both adults by then, and she was probably in her 70s. Nobody over 55 should run for public office because they're too set in their ways, and I'm old enough that I can say that.
My grandmother used to say things and then say, "I'm old, I can say that." there's, you know,
55 is the cutoff for a good for anybody who should run for public office, was her attitude, and you couldn't call her hand on it because she was well over 55.
She'd have a lot to say right now, I think.
Oh, she definitely would. She definitely would.
So I have one last question for you before we wrap up. What is your favorite place in St. Augustine history-wise? There, you know every place. What do you find the most fascinating here? What place?
The most fascinating place. Well, gosh, that's kind of hard because I tend to like small, cozy places. Probably the south end of Avalise Street, just before it gets to Bridge. And one of my favorite things was to walk on Avalise Street north, because you drive south. I mean, it's become much harder to drive on Avalise anyway, because that wasn't the direction you drove, and so you saw things from the other side. You know, if you walk against the traffic, you might say. And it's just it's a small little area. It's a great little area. It's, you know, it's not very commercial. It's, you know, the nuns have their place down there, and there's a few other small. Now there's some B&Bs, but that very south end, after past south of the Jimenez Facio house, is one of my favorite areas because there's always little vines creeping over the coquina walls and things like that.
We have only one dog left at our house, and she's too old to walk much. But when the dogs were younger, I had big dogs, and I used to walk them between like 5 and 6 in the morning, and I lived downtown, so I walked them all over the historic district and Lincolnville, and it was dark, and I always felt like I went back in time because there were no cars, there were no lights on. So walking those streets in the dark in the early morning took me back to, I don't know what era, but I felt like I was walking back in time. And so that area of Avalise specifically, I can appreciate what you're saying, because that's one area where, you know, I'm walking along on the bricks, and it just seemed like I went back in time.
And of course, you know, I was down at the oldest house for a number of years. And it's always interesting to see, especially the tourists, especially the ones that have probably rented the RV for the week. They get down one of those streets which they had no idea where they were going or how they were going to get.
Yeah. Not only are they going the wrong way, but they can't make the turn, and there's a historic coquina wall there.
and I had somebody ask me some directions one day, and actually I told them they wanted to go on that southern part of Marine Street. I said, well, you need to go down that street. What street are you talking about? And I said, that's not a street, that's an alley. And I said, in St. Augustine, that is a street, and it has been a street for 250 years.
Messing with the wrong person here.
You know, I just couldn't. That's an alley. No, it's a real street.
How do you want St. Augustine to be remembered?
How do I want St. Augustine to be remembered? Of course, obviously, I want it to be remembered, you know, as the oldest city in the U.S. Not just because it is the oldest city in the U.S., but I think, you know, I know Jamestown makes their claims, and
doesn't that drive you crazy?
I've almost quit letting it drive me crazy.
I can't imagine in your position how I would deal with that.
Well, but it eliminates the whole idea that the establishment, especially of Jamestown, and of course the very brief one on Roanoke, weren't done in response to the fact that St. Augustine was here. Because one of the things that King James tells the English as they go to establish someplace in Virginia, which of course ends up being Jamestown, he says, stay well away from the Spanish in Florida. You know, they might have settled someplace else.
So by their very establishment, they are recognizing that we were here first.
Well, not just that, but, you know, I mean, the situation among the Native Americans in the Southeast was very much affected by the fact that the Spanish had been here and that they had missions, halfway up what is today the coast of the state of Georgia. And so it had an effect, which we're learning more about. And I just think that, yes, I realize that our legal system and those sorts of things are, they come largely out of England and
British,
Britain. Yeah. But the presence of the Spanish and the things that they did, whether they were good or bad, very much affected what the English decided to do. And I think that's to me what gets lost. That's where the oldest comes in. It was like before you.
I have to tell you a quick funny story. I was on a trade mission to London, to England, about 5-6 years ago, real estate trade mission. And we were treated with a back of the house tour of Parliament. They weren't in session at the time. So, we had a tour guide. It was just incredibly interesting. And again, I love history, so I really appreciated it. But we were standing in this room, this massive room, where the members of Parliament go before they go out to the room. I can't remember if it has a name, but the room where they're actually meeting and what you see on TV. So big, massive, old building, big, massive. And they had these huge tapestries that were hung on the wall, and there were probably 6 or 8 of them, and they were depicting major memorable heroes for the English, military heroes. And so they had this one, he's telling us about each tapestry. They had this one tapestry, and he says, now, this tapestry depicts our great hero, Sir Francis Drake. He was a naval hero, a military hero. We honor him, and we're all from Florida. And so he stopped for a minute, and when, I said, that's so interesting, because in my town, he's not only an enemy, he's a pirate. And I said, so it's really a matter of perspective. That's so interesting.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that, of course, Drake's map, when he attacked St. Augustine, really gives us our first glimpse of what St. Augustine might have looked like. And of course he had attacked 4 other places, and he has a map of each of those. St. Augustine was the last one that he attacked. I think it was, I don't want to say right off the top of my head because I'll probably get it wrong and someone will correct me, because I called it his Caribbean cruise. Came up through the Caribbean and ended up in St. Augustine. So he gives us this, it is an idealized view of, it's almost like, here's what it looked like before I attacked it. It's braggadocio. Yeah. And those sorts of things. But you're right, it's not everybody has the same hero.
Right. So I have one more quick question for you, and then we'll wrap up. But I'm surprised to hear you once in a while in this interview, you said that you learned something when you did research. I can't even imagine that there are things that you don't know about St. Augustine. It seems to me like, I've known you for a little while. I know how well versed you are. The fact that you're still finding new things.
Well, there have been people who, let's remember how long there have been people here. And especially because of writing the column, my research ranges, well, from about the time the city was started until maybe around 40 or 50 years ago. I don't get too much into the present history for numerous reasons, which I won't talk about here. But there's lots, and the other thing is, you may come in, and this is really where a lot of people have problems with history, whatever it is. The past didn't change. The questions we ask of the past do.
Right.
So if I go back to something I've read before, and I'm looking for something else, I will see sometimes a phrase in there that I just looked right past before because it wasn't meaningful. Mm-hmm. I mentioned the talk I'm going to be giving in 2 weeks, and how St. Augustine in 1870 was still trying to come back, as many places were in the South after the Civil War, and what they're dealing with are some of the issues we're talking about right now. That is not a perspective in a talk I would have had a year ago. I would have seen this. I would have looked at the same newspapers, and I'd have probably said, "Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting." But it resonates more. Right. Not that everything's about the present, but it resonates more.
It just wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have. It wouldn't have caught your
attention.
Some
people say, "Well, history doesn't change." I said, "No, the past doesn't change.
It's your view of it, and
right.
the
I
relative
said,
importance.
and of course, one of the definitions of history is it's the study of change, because things are always changing. So, and there's always lots of things that you just haven't seen before. There's no way you could read everything.
Well, to me, that's really fascinating because, again, I know how much you know about St. Augustine, and the fact that you're still learning and picking up different things. I love history. I love hearing about it, and the fact that there's so much more out there about our little area that we have yet to really learn or focus on. That's interesting to me.
Well, and as we know, our lives keep changing, so we keep, it's, I mean, 60 years ago, most historians would have paid little attention to what women did.
I can understand that.
The records that I'm looking at, and the records that I'm looking at right now for this talk from 1866, 67, 70, there's not much about women in there. There's very little
They
about
were just
them.
there.
They were just there, right. I mean, you might find that
Kind of an encumbrance at some
you might find that there's some cloth, but they don't say it's to sell to the women. You just know they're the ones that are going to go get it and buy it and sew it. Certainly the focus on Native Americans was much different. Many of it was just especially along the eastern seaboard, as they just didn't exist anymore. They were gone. I still run into that all the time. Well, there weren't any Indians here. Okay. All right.
That's so interesting.
Or there's always that last line that's hard to, especially in St. Augustine, that's hard to contend with. I'm talking to somebody my age. That is not what my fourth grade history teacher told me.
Well, again, they're talking to the wrong person.
And I always want to say, and you haven't learned anything since fourth grade?
or has the rest of the world. Perspectives do change. Well, thank you, Susan. I really, really enjoyed having you in here. And I think I may have to ask you back because you could do a series all on your own with all of the knowledge that you have. But I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming in today.
Okay, thank you.
So this has been another episode of the St. Augustine Chronicles, the where, the who, and the how'd they get there. Watch, like, or follow us on Facebook at St. Augustine Chronicles Podcast or at SA Chronicles. You can also find us on YouTube at St. Augustine Chronicles Podcast. Watch, listen, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes. We're produced by Pete Melfi at the 904 Now, so you can find us also on the 904 Now Facebook page and be on the lookout for new shows every Monday.